Hey there everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful with David video. Like usual, we'll start with updates for the podcast. So this Friday, our latest episode will be dropping, and that'll be part one of our two-parter about boxing heavyweight champions. Basically, for this episode, each of us chose a couple boxing heavyweight champions from history, and talked about what's sort of historically and sociologically interesting about each of those champions. So this first part will be Nick and Cameron's choices that we talk about, and then part two will be about my choices, and then also about Muhammad Ali, because he's such a big figure. It would almost be like cheating for any one of us to really pick him. I mean, he's called the greatest for a reason. And so, again, part one, which will be dropping Friday, Nick and Cameron's choices that we talk about, and then part two will be mine, and then us talking about Muhammad Ali. So be on the lookout for those. But with that said, we'll get to this week's video. So, having done videos where I recommend books about U.S. history, Black American history specifically, and then also Latin American history, I figured it would be good to talk about U.S. foreign policy specifically, and give books about those because, of course, the U.S. is a world power, and how we got there, I think, is a pretty interesting story, and definitely what we've done since is really important to know. And so, it's always good to have kind of a well-rounded view of history that doesn't just include what happens at home, right? So here are 5 books that I recommend about U.S. foreign policy. So the first two that I'll kind of introduce together are Rise to Globalism by Stephen Ambrose and Douglas Brinkley, and then American Empire by Joshua Freeman, just by Joshua Freeman. And what's cool about these books is they both kind of talk about the same era, basically ever since the U.S. became a global power, and they up until about the year 2000. But they also kind of give you a really good broad overview, kind of like introductory jump in to American foreign policy during this time. And so it's a really good kind of primer. I would almost say kind of a textbook. They're not written like textbooks, but just in the sense that, you're getting a really good overview. In that sense, they're kind of like textbooks, but again, way better written. And they're really good complements to each other because, again, they cover the same thing, but they come at it from different angles. Because Rise to Globalism, I would say, it doesn't present the sort of post-World War II U.S. foreign policy system as, perfect, and it does kind of pick out what it sees as some flaws, but overall you can tell that the authors really think it is a good system, and, they have a lot of reverence for that sort of, post-World War II foreign policy order. Whereas the other one, American Empire, you can probably kind of tell by the name, is a little bit more ambivalent about everything. And so, you read both. One gives you kind of that pro World War II, post World War II world order sort of narrative, and the other one is a lot more critical. And so they're a really good balance for each other. The next one that I would recommend is Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer. And if you haven't seen any of my other videos before, I recommend Stephen Kinzer a lot because he is actually a journalist rather than a historian. And what's nice about that is, he consults with historians and people who know what they're talking about. So there is academic rigor to his work, but at the same time, the fact that he's a journalist means that his stuff is way more readable than that of the average person writing about foreign policy. And so Overthrow is basically just an overview of different regime changes that the U.S. has sponsored, kind of since becoming a superpower, but it even goes back a little bit more to the early 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century. So this isn't just about, Cold War coups and stuff like that, although obviously that is a big part of the book. But it also talks about, some of the U.S.'s kind of early forays in trying to be a regional power in, Latin America, specifically the Caribbean and Central America. So, that's a really good book for seeing how the U.S. has, unfortunately, a lot of times, against the interest of democracy, tried to be a kind of, world power that intervenes in other countries. Another one that's actually really recent is called War on Peace by Ronan Farrow. And so that one basically talks about the State Department and diplomacy, and basically how those have kind of been eroded over the last few decades, right? Because Ronan Farrow, kind of like, one of the other books I mentioned before, or authors of that book rather, he definitely has a lot of regard for, that post-World War II order that I was talking about before. And a big part of that order was the State Department, trying to resolve things through diplomacy rather than violence. And so his book is basically about how gradually, not necessarily the fault of like any one presidential administration per se, but kind of bigger forces at work, there's been a gradual reduction in the staffing and role of the State Department, and as a result, a reduction of diplomacy as a means of U.S. foreign policy negotiation. Which, if that sounds heady, for those of you who don't know, Ronan Farrow is actually also a journalist, and this is another book that is really accessible, even if you're not like super academic or super into like policy jargon, which is always really nice. And then, final book to recommend, because as a Latin American historian, I can't not recommend something about Latin America, The Killing Zone by Stephen Rabe. And I did mention this one also in the video about, Latin American book recommendations, but it definitely applies here too, because it really is mostly about U.S. intervention in Latin America. And it's like 200 pages, and it covers almost everything that the U.S. did in Latin America during the Cold War. And I haven't found a book that is that short while also covering so much stuff with a pretty good amount of like detail and nuance and analysis. So those are 5 books I recommend for getting into U.S. foreign policy. If you ever want to hear more recommendations, I definitely have more. I just didn't want to, mention a million books because, after a certain point, it's like, okay, this guy's recommending like 30 books. Like that doesn't, how am I going to pick from that list which to look into? So, if you ever have more that you're curious about, definitely, feel free to ask. A lot of the authors that I mentioned, especially Stephen Kinzer, are definitely ones who, just in general, have really, really good works focused on foreign policy. So that's this video for this week, everyone. Thank you for listening. Just so y'all know, we are going to be starting in early 2021 a Patreon. But don't worry, like, we're not going to be hiding any of the stuff that we're already putting out behind the paywall or anything. We're going to be just adding new stuff for Patreon, but, these videos, our normal episodes, our movie episodes, those are still going to be available just like always to you. So thanks for listening, and have a good week, everyone. Bye.